Welcome to Your City on Community 7 Television. I'm Shoots Veis and I'm your host. Each month we look at a different aspect of what's going on in the city of Billings. This month we're very excited to have with us Rich St. John. Rich is the police department chief for the city of Billings. Rich, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Shoots. Appreciate the invite.
You bet. All right, we're going to talk a lot about the police department and what you guys got going on. But before that, let's get into a little background about you. Did you grow up in the area? Did you come to the area? Give us a little history, a little background.
No, thanks for asking. My formative years were 35 miles or so south of Seattle in a town called Federal Way. I went to school there. And I ended up coming out to Billings to go to school at Rocky Mountain College. Just so happened that a student teacher at our high school became the head football coach at Rocky and recruited a bunch of us from the Washington area. And so that's what got me out here. Finished up in 4 years, did the obligatory time bartending at the cattle company, if you remember that, out in Rimrock Mall. And had been doing an internship with the police department and was fortunate enough to get hired almost 40 years ago in 1981.
Sure. So you've had a long career with the Billings Police Department. Walk us through some of the things that you've done while you've been with the police department.
Well, I've been so blessed throughout my career to pretty much experience everything the department has to offer, with the exception of working in the undercover drug unit. That one, my wife probably didn't like that so much. But as far as all the operations side of things, obviously spent a fair amount of time as a young officer in patrol, working all 3 shifts that we had. Spent time in detectives, working primarily juvenile cases. Was promoted to a sergeant, which is a first-line supervisor, then a lieutenant, ultimately a captain. And then later in my career, probably close to 20 years on, was made the acting chief back in 2007, and then ultimately the chief, and I've been here ever since.
Sure. All right. So let's step back a little bit. Get a big, broad view, 30,000 foot level. Well, why does the city have a department? What are you guys here to do? What is your role within the city that makes the city go?
Well, the police department is charged with enforcing local, state, and federal laws within the jurisdiction of the city limits. It is something that came about long before I was around, that an incorporated city over a certain number of population would have a professional police department. If you didn't have that, police services would be provided by the local sheriff's department.
Sure.
So that target number obviously was around when I got hired on, and so the police department again is responsible for enforcing those 3 laws specifically. Along the way, we also provide traffic enforcement, proactive policing, patrol, a wide variety of educational programs, and those things have really manifested themselves as time's gone on.
Sure. Give us a little bit overview of your department. How many officers do you have, and kind of what are they doing, and maybe then a breakdown of some of the different divisions you have. You touched on that a little bit in what you were doing, but maybe a better breakdown of all of those different departments.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently our authorized strength, and that's by City Council and City Administration, is 154 sworn officers. That would be from the chief all the way down. Largest police department in the state of Montana, which would make sense as we're the biggest city. We also have about 35 civilian employees, which provide our clerical services, our evidence techs, our evidence support, our animal control officers, and some other specialized positions. So in that 185, 190 full-time employee status with that. I like to describe the police department as a 4-legged stool. The first one would be the administrative leg of that, and that's basically the chief's office, the captains, the middle administrators, and basically what we do is run the day-to-day business of a police department.
Sure.
And that's exactly what it is. It's a business. We have budgets, we have policies, procedures, we have PR issues, we have personnel things to deal with. The only difference is with a lot of your listeners is that we don't sell anything. We provide a service.
Sure.
But other than that, the basic framework on how we conduct that business and manage it is the same. Another leg is the reactive side of things, and that would pretty much be our patrol division. So any officer that is in a patrol car wearing a uniform, and our detective division. So essentially what they're doing is responding to calls for service. So these are the officers that are out 24/7, 365, and they're answering the 911 calls. Last year, we hit about 97,000, about 1.5% higher than 2020. So we knew that we were on the increase. They handle a wide variety of calls, as everybody knows. Some very, very serious, and others not so much. The detective division, they handle the long-term protracted investigations that come out of a lot of the calls that the officers start.
Sure.
So they'll go there, take information, do what they can do, and then that case will be referred to a detective for additional follow-up. The difference being is that the patrol division is really tied to the radio, and the detectives are not so much. But you better be able to manage time, because they're all carrying about 20 to 25 felony cases apiece, and there's about 20 of them in that division. So it's just different on the thing. But the thing is that everything has already happened when they get involved.
Sure.
And where we're most effective is when we are proactive with our efforts, and that would be the third leg. These would be our officers assigned to specialized positions and task forces. So we have officers assigned to the U.S. Marshal Task Force. They're out looking for violent offenders. We have a drug unit, obviously, working our methamphetamine problem. We have officers assigned to internet crimes against children, the DEA for for prescription drug diversion, the ATF for felons in possession, and the list goes on. And what we find there is that these officers are able to be proactive and get in the middle of things before a crime is committed and somebody gets victimized. And that's where we really, really make a difference on our crime rate across the board. So I really want to make sure that we keep our staffing up where we can keep those positions fully staffed. And last would be our educational public relations side of things. Neighborhood Watch, Crime Stoppers, Business Watch, all the educational programs that we have, and they also oversee our volunteer program, who really probably the biggest thing that they do for the city is take care of our abandoned vehicle problem.
Sure.
They have done a magnificent job locating those things, getting them tagged, and getting them moved. If we didn't have that volunteer cadre, because of those 97,000 calls, that's a real low priority for our officers, and I would really hate to see what the streets of Billings would look like if we couldn't get to them. So I'm so thankful for the work that they do. And in general, that's what the police department looks like from that 30,000-foot view.
Sure. A couple of types of officers I want to take a special look at. One is the school resource officer, which, you know, I think is it can be a bit confusing about what their role is and who they're working for and how that all goes together. So explain to us what is a school resource officer, who they're working for, and what do they do? School resource officers are basically just that. We have 8 of them that are co-located at a couple schools. The high schools all have their own officers, and then the middle schools and grade schools split up the remaining. 5 of the resource officers are paid for probably 50-50 city school district. The remaining 3 are paid 100% by the school district. Okay. And even though they're picking up the bill, and the reason for this is that the importance of what they do in the school district is so monumental that the superintendent recognizes that. I don't have any other people to give them. So if you want additional service, then you get to pay for that, and they do that. And we've seen that in a couple other functions that we have that we can talk about. If you really think about School District 2 in its entirety, it's a community within a community. So, I mean, they have disturbances, they have the bullying issues, they have thefts, they have the fights, they have the rapport building, and that's what those officers do. If they were not in the schools, then those phone calls would be coming to regular patrol officers to provide those calls for service, and they may or may not get answered depending on what we have going.
So that's another example of a proactive program to really get in there, build those relationships, build the rapport, and to handle problems that come up on campus.
Sure, and then I'm assuming then we maybe have problems on a school campus, but maybe they're moving outside of that school campus. Now that school resource officer, yeah, they're in the school, but they're still a member of the Billings Police Department. They can access some of those resources as well.
Oh, absolutely. And during the summertime, I remind them they're not school teachers. They don't get the summer off.
Yeah.
So we use them either to do augment the patrol division, or we find some specialized things for them to do to help us eliminate some of the backlogs on things.
Sure. I know one of the other places that we have some specialized officers that I think you get some budget funding help is downtown patrol, bike patrol. Talk to us a little bit about what that program is and what it does.
The Downtown Business Alliance pays for 2 officers and a car. And then we provide all of the equipment and the supervision or whatnot, but essentially they are the community police officers for the downtown area. And they're not tied to any other call that we have going. They're pretty much answer to the business owners down there and really do a great job communicating with them. They're the first call for a business to say, I got a problem, that might be a quality of life type issue.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that is, that's their first line. So again, those are officers that are paid for by the downtown businesses. They're separate and apart from patrol. Again, they have a car, they're given bicycles, so those are the ones that you see out in the evenings, working the events, working some of the special things that you have going in the downtown area.
Sure. All right, let's broaden it back out to patrol. Let's talk a little bit about what it is, how many you got on shift at any one time, where are they at, what are they doing, what parts of the city are they working in?
So back when you were doing city government, we had 9 beats in the city of Billings. We had 9 beats when I started. Mm-hmm. They have become very, very dense and very, very elongated. Since that time, we've modified those to what we call zones, and there are 4 of those zones now, and they're subdivided up into 2 areas. Essentially, you still have basically the 9 beats, but it's more conducive to where you have geographical breaks such as the rims or
Sure.
27 things of that sort. So we still have a mandate which is governed by the union contract that we will go to work with no less than 9 people. And that is an absolute worst case scenario when by way of illness or vacations or school or injuries or something like that we show up to work with 9.
Yeah.
But if we do, that's the least that we're going to go to work with. And obviously that was a critical thing when COVID came because it wouldn't take too much to wipe out an entire shift.
Yeah.
So more realistically, we go to work with probably we have 3 shifts a day. Probably 13 to 14 officers are working to include supervisors, and we double up twice a day when the shifts overlap, so you would have double that.
Sure. Okay. And so then I'm assuming they come in, have kind of their meeting, here's what's going on today, and then they're out patrolling and then taking those phone calls. Is that kind of what their day-to-day looks like?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So again, our patrol division, 24/7, 365, they brief is what you're talking about, roll call. People may recognize that from TV, 3 times a day. So we go at 6 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 9:30 at night. Those are when the 3 shifts show up to start work. And then you can see that there's an overlap from 2 o'clock until 5, and then 9:30 until midnight.
Yeah.
So we have double the people on when presumably we are the busiest.
Sure.
And I can tell you that anymore we're busy all day long, all night long.
Yeah.
But that's when we have our personnel on. And so when they get their beat assignments, they head out to the respective area. Because of technology now, we have in our cars called mobile data terminals, or basically a laptop computer, and all the calls that are holding, all the calls that have been dispatched, all the calls that people are on are listed on their screen, and so they know where they're going to be sent. A lot of them volunteer to take things off the board and get those things cleared up, and those things just continue to pile up as things go on. Eventually it slows down a little bit. They have time to take a break, have a lunch break. Certainly paperwork looms heavily. We got to carve out some time for them to do that as well.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the partnerships that you have kind of in the community. I think probably number one that I would want to talk about and how you guys interact with the 911 call center. I believe the fire chief is officially in charge of the 911 call center, but it's got to loom large in your department and what you guys are doing. So talk about how you guys interact with that 911 center.
You are absolutely right. So the 911 center does belong to the fire department and under the supervision of Chief Rash and his staff. But we are by far the number one agency that drives the calls for service. So we work very well and very closely with them. We have a steering committee, if you will, of employees on both sides to make sure we meet on a regular basis to troubleshoot, to talk about things that came up. We're very mindful of specifically on very traumatic situations. I mean, do a really good job taking care of our officers, but you forget there's somebody on the other end of the radio that's listening to everything. They don't get to see it, and experience things. They have to listen, and then their minds, excuse me, then their minds have to try to feel in what that looks like. So we need to make sure that we take care of them too, on traumatic things and really stressful issues. But other than that, I think we have a great working relationship with them. They staff 2 dispatchers to handle our calls. That is in comparison to 1 for the sheriff's office, 1 for the fire department, and AMR, and then they might have a handful of call takers for the general public. So that gives you an indication the call load that comes into that facility that is directed to the police department.
Yeah. Let's talk about another agency that I'm sure you work very closely with is Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department. Talk about the different jurisdictions and how some of that overlap, and then maybe get into, let's talk a little bit about the jail and how you guys use the jail.
Sure. So the sheriff's office, basically, they have an enforcement arm to that. That would be the deputy sheriffs, and there's about 70 of them. And then probably the largest amount of personnel that Sheriff Linder has would be the detention facility or the jail down there. So as far as enforcement, Yellowstone County deputies have authority throughout Yellowstone County, to include the city of Billings.
Sure.
A city police officer, for the most part, unless you're assigned to a task force and been deputized otherwise, our jurisdiction is within the city limits with the ability to take enforcement action 5 miles outside. And really what that is designed to do is to support both the police department and the sheriff's office on the flanks of the city, because we are so far spread out, on the corners of the state. Other than that, we're both law enforcement officers. We enforce the same laws. Obviously the sheriff is elected. The police chief is appointed, so we're different animals in that light. We still have our bosses, county commissioners versus city council. But Sheriff Linder and I, we've been working together for a long time. He's just an outstanding law enforcement professional and great partner. He's faced with a very difficult task with that jail.
Yeah.
He was over capacity before COVID started. He was over capacity before they started their 100-bed build and then discovered a bunch of structural problems. And in the meantime, as the capacity of the jail gets choked down, we start seeing some pretty significant crime around here. Yeah. I think it's no secret to your viewers. We had 19 homicides that they know about, and 22 potential that could be charged that are under review. The last year we had anywhere close to that was 2015, and there was 11. So a lot of those people are going to jail, and we have a wide variety of crimes and activities where people got arrested. So space is a premium.
Yeah.
And so we worked very hard to get people into jail that needed to be there. In the meantime, we're dealing with a very aggressive and emboldened transient population. The citizens are seeing us write a ticket, write a warning, and send people on the way, and they don't quite understand. It's frustrating.
Well, and we've had the sheriff and Justice Carter on to talk about some of these issues at the jail and how difficult they can be, as far as who's there, who absolutely needs to be there, and we're at capacity, and we're going to have to make some hard decisions. How does that roll down then into your patrol department, and where do they go to say, you know, I mean, there's the obvious ones, like this guy's going to jail,
Right.
but there's got to be some tough calls that you need to make. How did those officers make that call? Do they got to call their supervisor? Like, how does that all happen?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Shoots. If we have somebody that absolutely has to go, whether it's statutorily required or whether this is just a bad person who's a threat to society, the sheriff has always made room. So there's really been no debate about that. The borderline ones, we generally will either ask one of our supervisors to call down there and ask permission, you know, come up with a nice story, try to convince them why they need to be in there. If nothing else, just hang on to them for a little while and let things decompress.
Sure.
And there was a time there that just because of the situation, the answer was no.
Yeah.
And that's very frustrating. And to the line officer, the reasons that we're talking about, they don't matter.
Right.
Okay, so they're very frustrated with the situation. That, I mean, it was the ultimate catch and release.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, when you combine that with some of the issues we were dealing with justice reformation going back to a couple legislative sessions ago, it wasn't uncommon for us to be arresting somebody for shoplifting 3 times in the same day because they know what the threshold is.
Yeah.
They know they're not going to jail. They get a traffic ticket. And then they go to the next store and shoplift again. Yeah. And that is extremely frustrating for the line op, and not just ours, but the deputies as well.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit. I want to make sure that I get to talk to you a little bit about public safety mill levy and how that happened. Talk to us about. I think we've laid out here a couple of times what it was and how they did it and how they switched, kind of how they're doing the taxing on that. But what did it mean to the Billings Police Department that safety mill levy passed, and you're going to see some relief in the public safety budget? And what are you guys going to do with those funds?
Yeah, so originally when we started having the safety levy discussion, it was to grow public safety pretty significantly. And I'm not talking just police and fire, but it was code enforcement, municipal court, and the city attorney's office all fall under the umbrella of public safety. And we had identified, you know, where we were short and what we could do and what our priorities were. COVID hits and really puts the community into economic uncertainty. You know, we had closures, we had a lot of people being laid off, things of that sort. So the council, in a very bold decision, and I really applaud them for that, and it's where I would have gone with it, is decided the time was not right to go out and ask to grow the police department, for example, 30 officers in 5 years.
Sure.
That's expensive.
Yeah.
And it's in perpetuity. And so because we had a $4 million hole in the public safety budget, and that's what brought us to have this discussion, the decision was made, let's just ask for enough money to plug the hole so we don't go backwards. Eventually they got around to asking the fire chief and I, what is it we want? And we both said unequivocally, we just cannot go backwards.
Yeah.
And so the passage of the safety levy by a 2-to-1 vote, I'm very thankful for that, really just plugged the $4 million hole so we don't go backwards. So we added no new personnel, no new equipment, didn't add any programs or anything like that. We remained status quo. Had it failed, when just for easy math, if the fire chief and I split $4 million, so $2 million in a department that's heavy in personnel, 80 to 82% of our budget is people, we're losing people in order to make up that money. And then when that happens, then the programs we were talking about earlier, those get adversely affected, and because I have to put people in patrol to answer the calls.
Sure.
So fortunately, that did not happen. Now we move to 2021, kind of seeing a little bit about what the economic outlook is. Not quite sure what Governor Gianforte is going to do with his COVID mandates. We have an outside agency, third party. The Center for Public Safety Management came in and gave a thorough review of the fire department and police department for efficiency and effectiveness, and we're awaiting their results. But I think unequivocally, at least with the police department, you are understaffed and overworked.
Yeah.
And so, with all this information, and the council may come back and say, well, it's not just us saying that we're shorthanded.
Right.
Here's a third party. And what does it look like? Well, as you're well aware, that the only way we can grow our department is at the approval of the voters. And so here we come again with our hat in our hand asking for another levy. So that, future discussion.
Sure, yeah, and I know I had Andy on last month to talk about budget and what he thinks is coming there. And, I think we've been a little bit lucky in the city that we haven't seen such a reduction in property values, and you probably won't see that then reflected in the loss of property tax revenue. So hopefully we're able to hold the line on that, but I know he's worried about some of the other aspects of COVID and how it's going to affect the city budget and all that kind of stuff. So it is nice that we got that switched over to the mills rather than so you can see at least a little bit of growth when the city grows as well.
Yeah, I'm very, very thankful across the board for the effort put in on the front end, the decision by the council, and then ultimately the voters. Really stepped up and showed me what they thought about their police department and in some tumultuous times nationwide.
Yeah.
Had that not been the case, it wouldn't have been, that big of a spread, if a pass at all, which could have been catastrophic.
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't even really get to touch much on COVID and how it's impacted your department, but so I'm just going to ask you a kind of overarching broad question. I guess, what have you learned about the city of Billings and the police department during a pandemic, which is trying for everyone? What did you learn about your department that you didn't necessarily know before? I've been a police officer for 40 years. I've been in the middle of this department, but putting this type of stress on the department, I didn't expect to see this happen.
Yeah, I think that, and it didn't really surprise me at all, is that the flexibility and the resilience of our officers, the discipline as well, because we put some pretty harsh mandates on them as far as, we didn't allow them to brief like we talked about. They were in a car with an MDT, so they were doing their distancing. We changed how they were dealing with the public. We changed how they interacted with suspects and arrestees. We mandated what it was that they had to wear for protective equipment. Office hours, and then when people did get exposed, how we handled that. And day after day, they answered the bell. And I was really, didn't surprise me. I'm very, very proud of that. And we had a couple people go down here and there, but when they got healthy, then somebody else might have been exposed. So due to their diligence about things, we didn't end up losing 10, 15 people at a time, which would have been problematic. And we had plans to deal with that, obviously, but we didn't get there. And so I think that, kudos for them for keeping a lid on things. As far as the city in general, I think for the most part, people really tried to abide by the mandates. I know frustrations about it, and you always had a few that were pushing the limits, but for the most part, people were pretty kind to each other, pretty respectful, and did try to follow the rules as much as possible. So I don't know if there was any surprises. It's I wouldn't expect anything less from our department or the citizens.
Sure. All right. Well, Chief St. John, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about the police department. And thank you for all the work that especially your staff does to keep us safe in the city of Billings. We all know it is not an easy job, and we really appreciate the folks in blue that answer that call every day. So thank you to you and to all that they do to keep us safe here in the city of Billings.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.